If you're a beginner and you want to start practicing cinematography, but you have no guidance or you don't know how, then watch this video before you go any further. In this video, I'm going to be sharing step-by-step tips on how you can practice cinematography so that you can go from a beginner to someone who knows what they're doing in less than a year. For those who don't know me, I'm Santo and I'm a videographer. I shoot content for clothing brands whilst also owning my own clothing brand as well. The first thing you're going to want to do is learn how to expose correctly. If you don't know how to do this, then 9 times out of 10 you're going to run into trouble and your footage is just going to look amateurish. Now, your exposure determines how dark or how bright your image is. A lot of people think exposing is easy and all you got to do is to make sure that you've got plenty of light. Whilst this isn't necessarily wrong, because obviously light is good for your camera, but as we all know, too much of anything can be bad, which means you can also have too much light. And trust me, if that happens, there's nothing that you can do to fix it in the edit. And that's why you gotta make sure that you expose correctly whilst you were shooting. Now you might be asking yourself, but Santo, how do we do this? Well, first of all, you need to learn how to control exposure. And that's with the exposure triangle. And that's made up of the aperture, the shutter speed, and the ISO. The aperture is the opening inside your lens that lets the light in. As you can see, you can make it wider or you can make it narrower. A wider aperture lets in more light, making your image brighter, whereas a narrower aperture lets in less light, making your image darker. Now these are measured by f-stops and they can vary depending on your lens. For example, this lens goes from 1.8 all the way up to 22, and the lower the number, the wider the aperture, meaning that you're letting in more light. You might be thinking, oh okay, so if it's too bright, then all I gotta do is just close the aperture a little bit and then that's it, right? Yes and no. Your aperture also affects your depth of field, which is how much of your image is actually in focus. If you close the aperture, you make the depth of field deeper, which means if you wanted to have the background blurred, then that blur will also decrease. And it might not be the look that you were trying to get. You might have wanted to get the background completely out of focus. So you gotta use the aperture carefully and with intention. The second thing in the exposure triangle is your shutter speed, and your shutter speed is the amount of time that your camera sensor is exposed to light for each frame. So if you decrease your shutter speed, then your camera sensor is exposed to light for longer. This in turn makes your image brighter, whereas if you increase the shutter speed, then obviously the image gets darker. But if you're practicing cinematography, then you would rarely touch the shutter speed. You normally have it at around 1/48 or 1/50, and that's because your frame rate will have been set at 24 frames per second most likely. And if you've watched any of my previous videos, then you know that your shutter speed should always be double your frame rate. Lastly, in the exposure triangle, we've got the ISO. Now your ISO controls your camera sensor's sensitivity to light. A higher ISO means your sensor will be more sensitive to light, meaning that the image will be brighter, whereas a lower ISO will make your sensor less sensitive, meaning that your image will be darker. It sounds simple enough, right? So if it's too dark, then all I gotta do is bring up the ISO and it's gonna fix it, right? Once again, yes and no. Whilst increasing the ISO will make your image brighter, if you increase it too much, then you're gonna add noise to your image. And trust me, you don't want that. Nobody wants to see those little grainy bits on the shadows of their footage. Definitely make use of the ISO to brighten up your image, but don't rely on it too much, because then otherwise you're sacrificing quality for the brightness. Think of it as like a protein shake. It's meant to be there as a supplement, but it's not meant to be your main source of protein. I hope that made sense. I think it did. Anyways, your camera has exposure tools that are going to help you understand how you're actually exposing your image. You've got the histogram, and if you're shooting on Sony, you've also got that light meter at the bottom of the LCD screen as well. With the histogram, as a beginner, you want to be making sure that you've got a good balance between your shadows, which are the dark parts of the image, the midtones, and your highlights, which are obviously the brighter parts of the image. So you want to use what you learn from the exposure triangle to balance that histogram, but don't just rely on the histogram and on the light meter that you've got also use your own eyes as well to try and gauge if the exposure is looking right. With the light meter at the bottom of your LCD screen, if it's showing up as 00, then it means you've got a balanced exposure. If it's on minus, then it's telling you by how much you're underexposing your image. And if it's got a plus next to it, then it's telling you by how much you're overexposing your image. Now that you've learned how to expose, you're going to want to learn about composition. Composition is about how you arrange all the elements in your frame. So you're using your subject, any objects, and the space around to guide the viewer's eye and help carry the story that you're trying to tell. One key composition technique that you need to learn is the rule of thirds. Imagine a 3x3 grid over your shot and place your subject where those lines intersect. This creates a well-balanced image and one that is also more interesting to look at. You can also play with the rule of thirds. So for example, if you want to make your character feel small, then you might place them on one of the bottom intersections and you would convey that feeling. Another composition technique is leading lines. Use natural or artificial lines in a scene like roads, architecture, or even a table, and this draws the viewer's eye to a specific point in that frame. But yeah, it can literally be anything. You can find leading lines anywhere. Another composition technique is a frame within a frame. This is when you place your subject within a frame that is beyond the frame of the screen. This helps to draw focus to the subject because it directs the viewer's eye to actually look within that frame. But it can also be used to tell a story or to drive the story. It can create like a mood or an emotion. For example, if you want to let the audience know that the character feels trapped or isolated, placing them within that frame can actually convey that feeling. And lastly, it can also add depth to your image because it gives it like a sense of three-dimensionality. Another technique is making use of different types of shots and different types of angles as well. For example, wide shots, which usually show the entire subject from like a distance, and are usually used as establishing shots to let the viewers know where the character is, their sort of surroundings, and to just overall let the audience in on the character's world. Then we have medium shots. These are usually used for dialogue scenes because it's close enough to let the viewers see the character's body language and gestures, but wide enough to let the audience see their interaction with other characters or other props. Then we have the close-up shot, which frames the character tightly, and it usually just shows the character's face or like their head, which is obviously good for showing the viewers the character's sort of subtle emotions because they can see little changes in the character's eyes, little facial expressions, for example like a teardrop or something. And then obviously camera angles are very important to learn because they can help to tell the story. For example, if you want to show that the character's feeling powerful, then you will do like a low angle shot and the subject will seem a lot more powerful. Whereas on the other hand, if you want the subject to feel more vulnerable or smaller, then you will do a high angle shot and then it will obviously convey that exact feeling. Once you've learned composition, it's time to move on to lighting. Now this is what's going to give your videos that movie look. If you don't know about lighting, then you're seriously limiting your skills. Lighting is what's going to set the mood and add some depth to your image. Now a great starting point for a beginner would be to learn 3-point lighting. So you have your key light, which is your primary and strongest light source, which is going to be lighting one side of your subject. Then you have your fill light, which is a softer light that you can use to fill in the shadows created by your key light. Then you have your backlight, which you obviously place behind your subject, and that's gonna separate them from the background and make the image look more three-dimensional. Once you've got the hang of this, then you need to know where to place your camera, which is on the shadow side of the subject. So if you've got your key light on the right side of the subject, then you need to be making sure that your camera, you place it on the left side of that subject. And as I mentioned earlier, this will add depth to your image and it will add to that three-dimensional look. Now it's very important to learn the different types of lighting as well, so you can understand what type that you actually need for your scene. So you've got your soft light, which creates more diffused and gentle shadows. Now this is the type of lighting that you'd probably see the most in movies. In order to achieve this, then you want to use something to diffuse your light source, which in your case will most likely be a softbox. Also bear in mind that the bigger the light source, the softer the shadows will be as well. And also, if you place your light source further away from your subject, that will also add to giving you softer shadows. Then you have hard light, which creates sharper and more defined shadows. You can probably use this if you're trying to go for a more dramatic and contrasty look. Now that you know a little bit more about lighting, it's about how you use that light. So whenever you're lighting a scene, it's very important that you subtly tell your viewers where that light source is coming from, and this is called motivated lighting. So for example, in this scene, the right side of my face is lit, and you as the viewer are assuming that that light is coming from the window on the right. Now this is very important. Whenever you're lighting a scene, you need to be making sure that the lighting is motivated, because if you don't, then it can actually take the viewer out of the scene, and even though they might not be able to tell exactly what is wrong, they can definitely feel that something is off. Now lighting equipment can be expensive, so if you don't have any, then it's fine. You can still create an image that's got depth, but you just gotta be making sure that you're making the most of the natural lighting that you've got. So you want to be intentional with where you place your camera as well, making sure that you are placing it on the shadow side, as I mentioned earlier. For example, this scene was shot without any additional lighting. It was just the light from the window coming in from the right side, but placing the camera on the opposite side of the window has allowed me to still create some depth in that image. Okay, now that you have all these on lock, what are you waiting for? Start filming yourself, because that's going to be the best way to actually improve. That way you don't have to rely on anybody else, and you can just get to shooting and work on your craft every day. So practice, and slowly but surely you will get there. Now I know there's a lot more techniques and concepts to learn about, like movement, but obviously these tips are for when you're filming yourself, and obviously you can't really have much camera movement. Now you don't necessarily have to learn in this way, but this is the order that I learn everything in. But to be honest, if you can learn these, then everything else should come in easier as well. But yeah, if you've watched the video up until this point, you're a real one, and who doesn't like to have real ones around? So please subscribe so that you can come along for the journey. It's going to be one full of excitement, full of learning, and I hope that you'll be here for it. So hopefully I will see you on the next video.